Well, what is smart growth? Well, it's not dumb growth. And what we're used to is kind of dumb growth. Part of it is sprawl. Sprawl is a great expanse of low-density urban development, disappearance of rural lands, among other things. And of course, this is what it looks like as you fly into LAX or to Ontario. You've seen this again and again. And typically, you can see on a clear day a little haze here of that orange-brown layer indicating the air quality. Why is sprawl bad? Again, pollution, traffic jams, farmland loss, increased school costs as you're duplicating infrastructure again and again and again as you're integrating people into the metropolitan area. One of the issues with regard to our basic regulatory format is our traditional zoning, which puts an emphasis on individual uses, which means that you have a house, in basic, you have housing separated from factories, from schools, from shopping, and so forth. And so, by nature, you've got to have individualized transportation. How'd y'all get here today? Again, auto dependency, again, an idealized graphic where you have housing separated from work, separated from schools, separated from shopping, and so forth. Wasteful consumption of resources, abandonment of central cities, and again, duplication of infrastructure and services. Shifting to a slightly different problem, though related, is high housing costs. With the exception of Hawaii, California has the highest housing costs in the country. The typical home in California is twice that of the U.S. home. And along the coast, it's 3 times the average cost. And that's an issue that increasingly we're becoming aware of. Why does that take place? You think if we have high housing costs, they'd be building more housing. There'd be more profits there. And here's a map that comes out of the Housing Community Development publication from last year. And you can see the highest cost housing is lined up here along the coast, except for a couple of outliers. So most of the highest cost housing is along the coastline. And curiously, in terms of housing construction, this area has some of the lowest housing construction. In other words, the highest housing construction is in the darker area. With the exception of Orange County, pretty much along the coastline you have relatively low construction. And also with regard to housing construction being low, that's where the jobs are. And that gets us back to transportation. In other words, if we actually had housing where there's jobs, we wouldn't have a transportation problem. In other words, why are there so many people parked out in the 91 right now? Because they're trying to go from the Inland Empire to Orange County to LA and so forth. Because that's where the jobs are, as indicated here. But of course, they're not producing housing there. Although housing is the most expensive, which kind of is logical. If you don't build housing, what's there goes up. But on the other hand, if you're a developer, wouldn't that be a challenge for you to start building more homes? Well, why is that? Well, just looking at a little bit more of an overall broader view, looking at the early 7 years of the millennium, you can see that housing construction in inland California went up all the way until the recession took place. But during that time, along the coast, production was relatively flat. There was a little bit of a bump, but not much. So during this time of high housing production, easy mortgages, production along the coastal areas was fairly stable. And in fact, going back to the Second World War era and post-war era, coming up to the millennium, you can see along the California coast, there's been a drop-off of housing production. Also, in the long term, in the inland area, there's also been a drop-off. And this is, by the way, percentages, so in a way you have to look at what the base happens to be. But you can see that there's been a lot more movement in terms of production booms in the inland area as opposed to sort of a constant downward trend along coastal California in terms of housing construction. Why aren't coastal areas building more housing? Community resistance. And it's tough for local politicians. I've been a member of SCAG for almost a year now, of the regional council, and you talk to other local officials, and it's dangerous to be promoting housing in coastal areas because a lot of the residents resist that. And again, you've got to be reelected in 2 years or 4 years, whatever it happens to be. Lengthy environmental reviews. Those of you who are in the development realize that in California, the California Environmental Quality Act and NEPA, on the other hand, also slows development down. Maybe in some cases, looking at the California Rapid Rail might be a good idea to slow it down a little bit. Local financial structure favors in terms of what banks are looking for. Banks tend to favor what is popular and what has been popular before. And also, obviously, as time progresses, increasingly more limited, easily developable land. When I first moved to California in 1981, going down the 91 towards Orange County, there's really nothing on those hills. And now, of course, they're just sprawling with homes. And of course, this is another way of looking at it. You probably can't see this, but again, it's looking at, again, the regulatory need for housing, the fees and fiscalization of land. In other words, although coastal areas are not building housing, there's always room for another office building or another commercial center. So there's this fiscalization of land use. And also here's community resistance and so forth. So looking at what the need is and what actually gets produced is significantly less. Now, in addition to that, and this is where we get back to an issue we're talking about, transit-oriented development. That's really one of the things that we're really focusing on, is that transit-oriented development is development where you have intensification of land uses around transit. For example, along Metrolink, heavy rail, SB 827, which is basically, it would prohibit cities from limiting heights lower than 45 feet or 5 stories, or 85 feet or 8 stories, from major transit stops. In other words, what his bill is proposing, that if passed, that it would take away the discretion of local jurisdictions to limit the heights of buildings to 5 stories or 8 stories close by a major transit stop or a major transit corridor. And there's specific definitions that I won't go into right now. Also, too, it will eliminate any minimum parking standards. In other words, it takes away parking ability. In addition to that, of course, is a tandem bill, 828, which right now the RENA, or Regional Needs Housing Allocation, essentially, cities' general plans have got to include room for 100% of the regional housing need as allocated by the state. What 828 proposes is to make that 200% of the RENA numbers. And also, too, from one 8-year cycle to the next, that you'll carry over what you didn't build in one 8-year cycle to the next 8-year cycle. That's, a little bit more than I want to get into, but the point is that Scott Wiener, again, who's been very successful in the past, is proposing essentially around transit to intensify development. And of course, that's a bill to watch. Now, what is smart growth? I just mentioned to you before, it's not dumb growth. Well, more specifically, it's a mix of land uses. It's compact building design. Again, 4 stories or 8 stories, compact building design, higher densities, a sense of place identity, preserve open space and farmland. If you condense and you compact growth, you're going to allow more land for parks and open space, which goes along with clean air quality. So smart growth. Transit-oriented development, smart growth with a focus. And again, I guess we just talked about this. Transit station with pedestrian amenities surrounding, high intensity development near the station, decreasing towards the end. Compact, walkable area with pedestrian connections, interconnected street network, and so forth. Many areas in Orange County and LA and also in the Inland Empire are planning. University of Redlands has got their transit-oriented development plans. I'm not quite sure. I know they've got them. Whether they've been passed or not, I haven't heard about that. And the idea of the transit corridor, again, think about the heavy rail Metrolink, or again, in San Bernardino, we've got 12 stops on our BRT. In the long run, we're planning that over the years, that there'll be an intensification of land uses around the various stops, beginning with the transit center, Rialto and E, and hopefully transform the commercial structure and also the housing structure. And of course, looking across Southern California, the possibilities of providing more housing, more development, and allowing people to be without their cars for several trips a day. What I want to show you is a TOD that's already existed in Claremont. In 1950, Claremont was a citrus growing area. In 1965, it produced 1 million boxes of lemons. The packing house, it looks like a packing house, but actually the packing house that was there before was demolished. They built something that looked like a packing house, but it's more appropriate to really a mixed-use development that they've got. Packing house, this structure has got 50 boutiques, 4 eateries, and availability of Metrolink. Close by, you've got this open-air patio, restaurant, park-like situation. You've got a fountain where the kids can jump around and play and do what kids do. And there's kind of some humorous. A little salamander here reading a book, among other things. Fun and amusement. So the idea of TODs, the packing house. Now what's left here is housing. So just next to the packing house, you've got hundreds of units of housing, fairly upscale housing. Different varieties, again, in close proximity. So thus people could live. Recreation is located right next door, so you don't have to drive very far. You've got a choice of eateries. And again, recreation areas. And then you've got the Metrolink to take you downtown LA or wherever you want to go. Now, is TODs an opportunity? Well, of course, in the past, how do we redevelop areas? Well, we had the redevelopment agencies. So after the Second World War, and really up until 2012, we could rely on redevelopment agencies to come in to condemn property, if necessary, through eminent domain, and to build, shopping malls, housing construction, and, among other things. But of course, in order to balance the budget, Governor Brown, and the court system, I should say, eliminated redevelopment in February of 2012, and so we don't have that anymore. And of course, that's where we get back to, I'm not promoting Scott Wiener's bill, but the point is, what his bill shows is the increasing frustration of the post-World War II growth that we've had. The reality is that you all got here of course you didn't have any option of getting here. You probably would have to take your car anyway. But the point is that if we live in another city like San Francisco, the choice would probably be a little bit different. In other words, you would have come here by mass transit, some of you. And of course, going back east, my daughter worked in DC for a while. And again, the massive numbers of people that take the metro and so forth. So I guess to summarize, transportation has sort of interwoven in the post-war era to provide one model of development, and it also provides the opportunity for a more sustainable form of development.